Pepi II was the last great ruler of Egypt's Old Kingdom. Upon his death, Egypt's sixth dynasty saw a couple of brief reigns before flickering out of existence. For the coming period, Egyptian pharaohs wouldn't leave behind many monuments and descriptions of their deeds, and soon enough, the sun rose over an Egypt under divided rule. With the sixth dynasty ending, Egypt enters a period of weakened central power. The first intermediate period of Egyptian history, sandwiched between the Great Pyramid-building Old Kingdom of Egypt and the coming Middle Kingdom of Egypt, starting when Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty united Egypt once more. But with unification far into the future, we find ourselves at the end of Egypt's sixth dynasty, and an Egyptian throne that had earlier in the sixth dynasty seen a loss in the level of pharaoh-centered dominance previously typical of the Old Kingdom. The governors, or nomarchs, of the administrative units of Egypt, or nomes, had been growing in power, building themselves elaborate tombs with walls relaying their stories. Moving even earlier than the 6th dynasty rise of the nomarchs, the late 5th dynasty witnessed Lower Nubia, the area between the 1st and 2nd cataracts, gain their independence. This area contained C-group nomadic chiefdoms, the C-group culture having entered Nubia during Old Kingdom times. Beyond the 2nd cataract sat a town-state, likely the place known as Yam in early Egyptian records, and definitely the place that's known starting in the Middle Kingdom as Kush. Now enters the fairly foggy First Intermediate period, starting with the 7th and 8th dynasties of Egypt, who continued to rule from Memphis. Their rough dates are 2181 to 2160 BC, though the dates for this period and many of their pharaohs are riven in debate, and the fair amount of debate colors the dates for the coming Middle Kingdom as well. As for these First Intermediate period pharaohs, for the most part, they leave behind little or nothing for us to know them by. One innovation of note that comes on board during this intermediate period are the Coffin Texts. The Coffin Texts are writings, and sometimes accompanying imagery, on the inside of coffins. The writing aided in getting the coffin inhabitor to the afterlife, serving a similar function to the pyramid texts we met earlier in Egypt's history. Only now the blessings of the afterlife apply to more people and are possible for regular upper-class individuals. The 7th dynasty is described as being very short-lived, only months long, and may not have existed, being considered by some to be a mere metaphor for the chaos following the 6th dynasty. The 8th dynasty is somewhat better known, at least a number of its alleged kings are firmly established as confirmed historical figures. Some of the king names, along with the fact that the base of power remained in Memphis, suggests continuity of an unclear extent with the 6th dynasty and possible 7th. But around 2160, that would change with a new dynasty, the 9th dynasty, established at a new capital, Heracleopolis. It's during this 9th dynasty period that the most well-known powerful nomarch, Ankhtifi, is generally thought to be from. Ankhtifi ruled in the south. He described his story in a self-glorifying tomb autobiography, which tells of his accomplishments with Ankhtifi, not the pharaoh, front and center. He ruled 2 nomes and allied with, quote, the general of Armont, unquote, against Thebes. Armont is a town just over 10 miles south of Thebes, but Ankhtifi describes how Thebes ignored his desire for open battle and ascribes that to their fear of him. Ankhtifi describes himself as the greatest human to have ever humaned, saying, quote, nobody like me has existed, nor will he exist, unquote, and that he had, quote, surpassed the feats of my ancestors, and those who come after me will not be able to equal me in any of my feats in this 1,000,000 years, unquote. Only marginal mention is made of the pharaoh. The 9th and 10th dynasties ruled from their capital at Heracleopolis, perhaps spanning around 135 years around the time period 2160 to 2025 BC. We have a much better attested to 11th dynasty enter the scene from Thebes, however, perhaps around 2125 BC, as Intef I started his own dynasty. The new Theban-based power would soon bring the north under their rule as well, entering Egypt into a new period of unified rule, the Middle Kingdom, which would eventually bring a heavy lean back into a pharaoh-centered Egypt as the nomarchs were weakened and melded more fully into the pharaonic system. The king following Intef I was Wahank Intef II. He was titled the King of Upper and Lower Egypt and ruled from perhaps 2112 to 2063. He wasn't, in fact, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, but his title testifies to him thinking that he ought to be the king, and he expanded his dynasty's control over southern Egypt to the north up to just south of Asyut, and to the south, likely reaching the first cataract. Expansion continued under his successor, Intef III. Asyut came under Theban rule, and Theban rule extended even further north, perhaps to the 17th nome. It's under Intef III's generally thought to be son and successor, Mentuhotep II's rule, that the Theban dynasty unified Egypt, culling the First Intermediate Period and adventing the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep II continued the expansion north, and upon ending the rival dynasty of Heracleopolis, he commemorated the new reality, changing his kingly title in his 39th year of rule to He Who Unifies the Two Lands. With this, perhaps shortly after 2020 BC, the Middle Kingdom proper begins. The Middle Kingdom would last for the duration of the 11th dynasty, the whole of the 12th dynasty, and then into the 13th, before unified rule over Egypt wanes once again around 1700 BC. First up was Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty. Nomarchs remained significant despite their return to one pharaoh rule. However, we already see with Mentuhotep II the beginning of attempts at further centralization by the pharaoh, along with the deification of Pharaoh Mentuhotep. His efforts of centralization included the splitting of Egypt into two administrative bodies under a governor of Lower Egypt and a governor of Upper Egypt respectively, who represented him more directly and had greater authority than the Nomarchs. Mentuhotep II is followed by Mentuhotep III, who resurrected Egypt's reach to include expeditions to Punt. Then came the last of the 11th dynasty of Thebes with Mentuhotep IV. One expedition conducted under his reign was to the Wadi Hammamat, and Mentuhotep IV's vizier, Amenemhat, who led the expedition, may be the same as the next pharaoh, the first of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat I. Amenemhat I had the capital moved from Thebes closer to the traditional centers of power up north, at a city that's yet to be discovered, which he had built and named after himself, Amenemhat Ich Tawi, Amenemhat, Caesar of the Two Lands. The exact location of the city remains undiscovered, though it's presumed to have been nearby to the 12th and 13th dynasty burials at El Lisht. The 12th dynasty saw pharaonic rule flourish, and these pharaohs leave behind significantly more than their 11th dynasty predecessors, as well as significantly more than the following 13th dynasty. Of primary concern to the pharaohs of this period would be Nubia to the south and developing the Fayum. Amenemhat I starts the 12th dynasty off and had sufficient centralized control to leave behind the first pyramid of approximately Old Kingdom size since the time of Pepi II, the last great king of the Old Kingdom. His successors would build pyramids of their own. Reflections of the Old Kingdom, indeed remnants of the Old Kingdom, also found themselves literally stuck inside this pyramid, as relief-decorated Old Kingdom monuments were part of what filled the pyramid's core. Probably dying from assassination, Amenemhat I was followed by his son, Senusret I, who most would have it had earlier been named co-regent with his father. Though this issue is still debated, it seems to me anyway that the majority are of the opinion that co-regencies were adopted by Amenemhat I and somewhat standard for the 12th dynasty of Egypt and used more sparsely through much of the rest of Egyptian history. Senusret I sent expeditions to the Wadi Hammamat and the Sinai for quarrying purposes, from which he got the granite that leaves behind the oldest surviving obelisk. Senusret's Egypt also campaigned against Nubia, extending Egypt's border to the second cataract, and Senusret had a number of fortresses built there that for the time being housed soldiers for relatively short durations before they were rotated out and replaced with others. Beyond the second cataract lie the independent state of Kush, and Kush and Egypt traded with each other. The following two pharaohs, Amenemhat II and Senusret II, continued with quarrying expeditions and corresponding building, but not much military activity. Trade between Egypt and the Near East prospered under Senusret II, and he had a dike and canals built in the Fayum to increase arable land through draining parts of Lake Moeris. Following the relatively peaceful times of Amenemhet II and Senusret II, there arose the warrior pharaoh Senusret III. Senusret III reigned from perhaps 1870 to 1831 BC. He campaigned numerous times against the Nubians, and he built more fortresses, including at the Second Cataract, and he extended the border slightly south. He further campaigned in the earliest known Egyptian military campaign up the Levant. A stele from Senusret III's reign was discovered in Abydos, and while primarily written to honor a man named Sebek Ku, a chief district supervisor of the town Ja, part of the inscription testifies to an Egyptian campaign which reads, quote, "His Majesty proceeded northward to overthrow the Asiatics. His Majesty reached a foreign country of which the name was Sekhmem. Then Sekhmem fell, together with the wretched retinue." Sebek Ku then describes his own role in the affair, quote, "When I was acting as rear guard, then I rallied together the individuals of the army to fight with the Asiatics. Then I smote an Asiatic. Then I had his weapons taken by 2 individuals of the army, without deviating from the fight, for my face was forward, and I did not turn my back to the Asiatic." Unquote. That last phrase of courage is particularly compelling when Sebek Ku tells us that he did not turn his back to the Asiatic, as it nicely reflects Senusret III's ethos himself when he insults the Nubians on a stele set up down south by the Second Cataract. He refers to the Nubians and says, quote, "One is aggressive to him and he shows his back. Retreat and he becomes aggressive. Not people to be respected, they are wretches, broken-hearted." Unquote. Beyond campaigning mostly in the south, but also in the north, Senusret III tightened up control over Egypt proper, integrating the Nomarchs into the centralized pharaonic system. Under his reign, the title Nomarch comes to an end, and Egypt is divided into 3 administrative entities. The area north of Ichtawi, the area from Elephantine, which is right beneath the First Cataract, up to Abydos, and then the region in between those two. Each center would be run by 1 person at the top, 1 immediately below him, then a council, and numerous officials and scribes. The large tombs that had already started in the late Old Kingdom period, associated with wealthy and powerful individuals at various nomes, comes to an end, while many more large tombs start being built near the capital, Ichtawi. Senusret III was followed by his son, Amenemhet III, and centralized Egypt flourished. Sporadic quarrying in the Sinai turned to more intensive projects, and the quarries of Egypt herself were tapped at increased intensities as well. He further sent trade expeditions to Punt and Bia Punt. The material drawn from the quarrying expeditions were used in his construction projects, and he furthered the land reclamation project around Lake Moeris. After Amenemhet III came Amenemhet IV, whose reign is less known, but seemingly saw continued peace and construction, though perhaps decline began to set in. He was followed by a woman, perhaps his wife, Sobek Neferu, who was the last pharaoh of the Great 12th Dynasty. Her name is the first of an Egyptian ruler to be associated with Sobek, whose cult had seen a rise in popularity. Sobek Neferu ruled for around 4 years, and the next dynasty to rule Egypt, the 13th, leaves behind far fewer records than the 12th. The 13th dynasty picks up perhaps around 1773 and sees many kings, most of them reigning for a short amount of time and no longer following any clear rules of succession. Egypt, however, continued to be run fairly smoothly, while the amount of Asiatic migration into Egypt grew, with many settling in the eastern delta and at least some holding on to their cultural ways. And soon enough, around 1700 BC, there emerged rival dynasties to the 13th in the Delta, the Hekau-Khasut, that is, rulers of foreign lands, or, more famously, the Hyksos. Divided rule had returned to Egypt once more, and with coexisting Egyptian and Hyksos rulers, Egypt enters the Second Intermediate Period. Unless I feel compelled to move to another topic, next week's video will be on that Second Intermediate Period and the start of Egypt's New Kingdom.